I still remember the exact moment everything went wrong. The cold, sterile air of the underground storage facility seemed ordinary enough, laced with the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the distant clang of steel doors closing somewhere deep in the tunnels. But that night, after years of suppressing the feeling that something was wrong, the unbearable truth finally slammed into me: breaking Rule 5 is a death sentence. And I nearly paid with my life. The warning came too late. I'd been told about Rule 5 100 times since my first day, but like most, I never fully grasped the gravity behind it. Don't open that door. Don't look beyond the marked zones, they'd say curtly at safety briefings, but no one explained why. Everyone acted like it was just company paranoia or an obscure safety protocol, something to keep newbies in line. But there was a third meaning, a danger so absolute that crossing that line didn't just risk a reprimand, it meant you vanished. That night, the air felt heavier than usual, like the facility itself was holding its breath. I was finishing some late shift inventory checks near the West Wing, a low-ceilinged maze of numbered lockers and maintenance closets crisscrossed by pipes and flickering emergency lights. I keep my head down. But then I heard the noise, a faint metallic creak behind door 37. It was unmistakable because door 37 was precisely the one bound by Rule 5. The radio squawked static suddenly, cutting all normal chatter. A distant scream pierced the stillness. I stared, frozen, heart hammering, watching as the door itself began to groan open, as if forced by something unseen. I knew the moment the door cracked that everything forbidden was flying apart, and someone was about to cross that fatal line. I should have retreated, but curiosity and something darker, maybe guilt, pulled me forward. What had they been hiding? What had my coworker done to break the rule? The corridor beyond the break in the door was an abyss, a black pit swallowing all light. I heard the panicked footsteps pounding behind me. "Shut it! Shut the door," someone hissed. But it was too late. A cold wind poured out like a breath from hell, icy and sharp, crawling up my spine, filling my lungs, crawling past my ribs. My breaths hitched. Shadows danced grotesquely along the walls, whispering voices barely audible but maddening. The smell, an overpowering stench of rust, decay, and something else, something dead, choked me. That was when I saw it. Not fully, but enough. A shifting darkness, a shape that shouldn't exist, slithering with unnatural motion just beyond the edge of the light. The thing that waits behind Rule 5. The screams burst forth again, nearer now, desperate and broken, swallowed abruptly. My coworker's fate was sealed. Whoever had crossed that line didn't get to live another heartbeat. The facility's alarms began blaring, but their shrill tones were nothing compared to the hammering fear inside my chest. I ran blind through the dim corridors, tripping over cables, lungs burning, knowing I was lucky to escape the grip of whatever that darkness was. I slammed the door shut behind me, the echo mixing with a bone-chilling wail fading into silence. Breathless, heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst, I leaned against the cold metal wall and tried to steady myself. I had no idea what I'd just survived. But one truth was seared clear: Rule 5 was no joke. It was a barrier between life and oblivion. And that night, someone paid the ultimate price for stepping beyond it. This is why I tell you now, listen carefully, and don't ever forget, beware Rule 5. Because once broken, you won't live to regret it. I still remember my first day working at the underground storage facility, the smell of damp concrete and cold steel, the dense silence broken only by the faint hum of machinery. It was the kind of place you don't leave much light or warmth, but you learn to survive in it. I wasn't looking for thrills when I took this job. Just a paycheck, a steady routine, something predictable beneath the crushing weight of the world above. The elevator ride down was its own strange kind of descent, a long, rattling trip through darkness. The walls squeezed closer the deeper I went, lights flickering sporadically as if uncertain about keeping me company. I remember gripping the rail tighter, trying to pretend it was just the usual noises of an old building settling. Only when the elevator doors opened to reveal those endless rows of lockers, storage units, and pipes twisting off into shadowy corridors, did I realize how far away from daylight I actually was. The facility itself was like an underground city, or maybe a graveyard. The walls were stained with decades of neglect, and the faint drip of water echoed constantly, like a heartbeat in the underground silence. I learned quickly that everyone had a routine, some work nights, some days, and you learned to stick to your schedule or you'd be swallowed by the place. Part of the job was not just about keeping track of stored goods but understanding the quirks of a place that almost seemed alive. I was assigned to inventory management, mostly checking storage units, logging in and out shipments, and making sure the facility's strict guidelines were followed. Almost immediately, I noticed the subtle tension between coworkers. Most were polite but closed off, like they knew something I didn't. I tried to strike up conversations during coffee breaks in the small break room, but the answers were always clipped or vague. One guy, Tom, was the most open. He'd been down here for years and had a dry sense of humor that cut through the monotony. "Don't get too comfortable," he said on my third day. "This place, it doesn't like to be messed with. Rules aren't suggestions, kid, they're how you stay alive." I laughed it off then, but even his tone carried a sharp edge of warning. The deeper I went into the facility each day, the more I noticed things that didn't quite fit, a faint whispering from empty halls, cold spots that seemed to follow me, lights that flickered even when the circuits were fine. Most workers shrugged it off, blaming aging infrastructure or exhaustion. But there were moments I caught myself holding my breath, glancing back down a shadowy corridor that suddenly felt much too long. The most unsettling part? The rules. They had a whole binder full of them, and every new employee was drilled on the importance of following them to the letter. Nothing about these rules ever felt normal. Some were basic safety protocols, but others were oddly specific and, frankly, bizarre. Rule 3 forbade talking loudly past midnight, Rule 7 banned photography anywhere in the facility. But it was Rule 5, never crossing into unauthorized zones, that everyone treated like a sacred, unbreakable law. My shift cycles started to blend together, hours spent counting lockers, logging stored equipment, keeping an eye on the surveillance feeds. Cameras dotted every hallway, but curiously there were always blind spots, sections the cameras never covered, places even supervisors avoided discussing. "Those areas," Tom once said with a nervous glance, "are just part of the building you don't try to understand." The strangest thing was how the place seemed to get smaller and larger all at once. The map they gave me on day one showed a finite layout, but wandering the halls during late shifts, I sometimes stumbled where I thought I shouldn't be, corridors that appeared where none were expected, doors to rooms not marked on any chart. I chalked it up to exhaustion messing with my senses, or maybe the building's labyrinthine design. Even normal conversations among the staff carried an undertone of unease. People spoke in half-truths and dropped vague hints about past incidents. There had been disappearances, near accidents, and things people weren't allowed to talk about. The workplace gossip ran silent whenever I pressed too hard, and I was told firmly, almost coldly, to mind my own business. I couldn't shake the feeling there was a secret edge beneath the everyday routines, something lurking just out of sight beneath all the task lists and safety warnings. Every time I answered a call over the radio and heard static crackling through, or a low thud reverberated in an empty storage bay, my skin prickled like electricity. Still, the camaraderie was real enough. I found brief moments of levity with the few coworkers who would open up. Sharing rationed coffee in the break room, recounting odd stories about the facility's quirks, it helped keep the creeping fear at bay. But even in these moments, the shadows felt longer, the silences heavier. By the end of my first week, I realized this place wasn't just cold, dark, and quiet, it was waiting, watching. A place with teeth and patience, where the rules weren't about safety protocol but control that I knew that one misstep could be fatal. And yet, no one ever gave me the full story. Only the warnings and the sense that underneath the routine, the facility had a story darker than I could imagine, that I didn't want to believe the whispered rumors, but deep down, I felt it creeping closer. Something was wrong beneath the surface, and it was only a matter of time before I saw exactly what that meant. After my first week, it became clear the rules down here weren't just guidelines, they were a code etched into every corner of this underground labyrinth, spoken in whispers and enforced with a silent, brutal finality. Nobody explained the why, only that breaking them wasn't just against policy, it was dangerous. The thick rulebook was handed to me on day one, a thin manual with oddly formal language, but it felt more like a ritual than a reference. Pages packed with do nots and must nots, each rule outlined with blunt finality. Some were rational, like no open flames or report all structural damages immediately. Others seemed almost ritualistic, bordering on the absurd or sinister. Rule 4 forbade wandering after dark without a buddy, which I figured was just for safety. Rule 5, though. Rule 5 was the one that nobody ever talked about outright. The way people avoided saying it aloud hinted at a deep fear, edged with reverence. Don't break Rule 5, everyone warned. That's how they get you. When I pushed for details, I got half smiles, nervous sidesteps, and vague references like, "You don't want to know," or "It's better if you don't ask." Even during breaks, when gossip might flow freely elsewhere, down here the office chatter was a careful dance around certain forbidden topics. People shared stories about old incidents, but they were always incomplete, punctuated by sudden silences or defensive glances. One afternoon, Tom, a guy with tattoos appearing faintly beneath his worn uniform, spoke to me quietly, sliding a coffee cup across the break room table. "You ever hear about what happened to Jenkins?" he asked, eyes darting around that I shook my head. "He broke Rule 5, 'cause he was stupid or desperate. Took a shortcut through an unauthorized storage bay, someone thought it'd save time. No one saw him after his shift ended. The next day, his locker was empty as if he'd never been there." Tom's voice dropped lower. "We don't talk about what happened to him, but word is, the place watches and punishes the ones who cross that boundary. Folks disappear fast. Like they never existed." The rumors stretched back years. From what I gathered, several employees had vanished, some blamed on accidents, others on discipline administered by the facility itself. Though no one alive dared speak openly about the truth, the rules had grown from necessity, they said. Before they were enforced strictly, odd things happened. Equipment malfunctioned inexplicably, people went missing without trace, and the facility's shadows seemed to stretch longer, thicker. Rule 5's origin was a mystery wrapped in company lore and hushed warnings. Few ventured beyond the authorized sectors, fenced and monitored by layers of security, where the facility expanded into unused tunnels and sealed chambers. Cameras shunned these zones like they were poisonous, and the digital maps didn't dare chart those depths. One night, during a slow shift, I overheard a conversation that sent cold dread through me. Two veterans, voices low, spoke in rumbling whispers near the security office. "It's not just a damn rule. It's a line drawn in something older than the facility. You cross it, you stir things that don't rest. Word is the ones who vanish don't just disappear," they claimed. The place takes them. At the time, I wanted to believe it was idle superstition, some dark joke to keep tempers in check. But there was something primal in their fear I couldn't ignore. Day by day, the rules embedded themselves into my brain like a heartbeat. Always watch where you step. Always respect the boundaries. Always follow the protocols without question. The tiniest misstep meant more than a detention or firing, it meant you might never see the surface again. And gradually, I noticed how the facility itself seemed to enforce these boundaries. Doors refused to open. Lights flickered out near certain corridors. Radios garbled whenever someone approached forbidden zones. The building wasn't passive, it was actively protecting, or imprisoning. Rumors among the crew also hinted at unusual security measures. Some claimed the cameras could see more than they recorded, or that the facility could lock down entire sections instantly, sections where no one was allowed, because whatever was in there feeding off Rule 5's broken promises was waiting. A few older employees whispered of a time when entire teams vanished during repair missions, never seen again. Their names were erased from all records as if they'd been scrubbed from reality to keep others in line. It became clear that knowing the letter of the rules wasn't enough. You had to understand the spirit of them, to respect the invisible boundaries drawn by something much darker than management directives or occupational safety. Even as I tried to keep my skepticism intact, the stories gnawed at me. What was buried beneath this place? Why were we all trapped in these rituals? Why did Rule 5 loom over everything like an executioner's sword? The air often smelled heavier after sunset, humming with silence that begged to be broken. Sometimes when passing the restricted doors, I felt waves of cold like a current, as if the building exhaled warnings I couldn't hear. That's when I realized, whoever devised Rule 5 wasn't just protecting property or preventing accidents. They were defending something alive and hungry beneath the surface, a secret so deeply ingrained in the very walls that no one dared defy it. And yet, people still did. Whether foolish, desperate, or blind to the danger, there would always be those who tested the limits that I wasn't sure if I was ready for the consequences of learning why. The underground facility had a way of twisting your senses until you weren't sure what was real and what was just your mind playing tricks in the dark. At first, the oddities were subtle, things I could explain away or ignore. But over time, those strange moments started piling up, casting a shadow over my every shift. That IT began with the noises. At first, just faint clicks, taps against metal pipes, or soft scraping sounds echoing distantly through the ventilation shafts. Nothing anyone else seemed to notice or wanted to acknowledge. You'd hear it for seconds, then silence, like the building itself was breathing just out of sync with you. One night, as I was making my routine rounds through the East Wing, I paused near an old storage locker that hummed with a faint electrical buzz. The air around it felt colder, colder than the rest of the facility's chill, and as I stepped closer, I swore I heard whispered voices, too quiet to make out words but layered with urgency. I froze, heart pounding, scanning the empty corridor. No one was there. Sure, it was probably the hum of machinery or my imagination playing tricks in the silence, but a steely part of me knew better. The next week, the flickering started. Lights in certain hallways refused to stay steady, sometimes going out mid-step and plunging me into darkness I had to navigate by touch alone. People joked about the faulty wiring of the aging facility, but beneath the humor, I caught glimpses of something more unsettling. When those lights died, the shadows seemed to stretch toward me, as if inching deeper into existence with each blink. One evening, I was working near the maintenance bay when the ventilation system suddenly screeched a horrific, shrill cry that rolled down the tunnels like a warning. The sound was so unnatural, it unnerved everyone. Workers stopped and stared at one another, faces pale. Tom, who was usually unshaken, muttered, "That's not right." That's never happened before. No one could say why, but from that moment, those strange noises became more frequent, as if whatever lurked in the depths was growing restless. Some coworkers brushed it off, telling me I was reading too much into things. Fatigue makes people's minds wander, they said. Stress can create shadows where there are none. But others grew quiet, eyes flickering nervously toward unmarked doors and blind spots in the security monitors. I started seeing movement out of the corner of my eye, fleeting shapes that vanished when I turned to look. One time, I caught a figure standing still at the end of a hallway, cloaked in shadow, but when I blinked it was gone. The facility, which had felt familiar and concrete, was twisting into something alien. Things began to malfunction. Communication radios garbled with bursts of static interference at the worst moments, power units failed unexpectedly, plunging parts of the underground into sudden darkness. Equipment vital for inventory checks occasionally stopped working or displayed error codes no technician could explain. Tensions mounted as unexplained failures put everyone on edge. Then came that night. I was paging through logs near Sector C-17 when the facility's emergency alarm shrieked to life. The harsh red floodlights flickered on, throwing stark shadows across the walls. Over the intercom, a voice barked for immediate lockdown and evacuation of the affected areas. There had been a system breach. People scrambled, disbelief etched on their faces. No one had seen the cause, nothing showed up on any camera feed. But whispered rumors spread instantly. Someone had crossed into a forbidden zone, and something had been unleashed that I remember the cold dread sinking deep into my bones. The supervisors were tight-lipped, all they said was to report immediately to the safe zones and follow protocol. But on our way out, we passed a sealed metal door near the east storage wing, door number 37, the same one labeled under Rule 5 warnings. The silence around that door was suffocating. Nobody stopped to look, but my eyes lingered. The faintest scorch marks marred the surface, almost like claw scratches. A low vibration thrummed beneath the steel. Something had forced its way through, defying locks and security measures. Tom caught my gaze and whispered fiercely, "Break Rule 5 once, and it's not just the company you answer to." As the lockdown was lifted hours later, the atmosphere in the facility grew heavier, thicker with unspoken fear. Staff avoided each other, conversations drying up. Some people outright refused to go back to certain sectors, their faces pale with a kind of panic that seemed to bubble just beneath the surface. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had slipped free in that blackout, some darkness beyond protocol and reason that we resumed work under a strain of tension, doing our best to ignore the whispers and the flickering shadows, but for me, that night shattered any remaining sense of safety. From that point, I realized the facility was no longer just an underground storage space. It was a carefully controlled cage, one holding back a growing, restless presence that was waking up right beneath our feet. That night was the beginning of the descent, the moment when the facility stopped being just a workplace and started feeling like a trap. It began innocently enough, with what should have been a routine inspection. Following the alarm and lockdown incident, management demanded extra safety checks, something about potential structural weaknesses in the lower sectors. I was assigned to assist, along with a small team, to verify sealed storage rooms and check the integrity of walls and doors. The group was tight-knit: Tom, who'd been watching me closely since my arrival, Sarah, a quiet technician whose eyes darted nervously, and Jensen, a gruff older man who'd survived too many strange shifts to show much reaction. The inspection started on schedule, our flashlights piercing through the thick darkness of corridors untouched for years. The air grew heavier as we descended, the sound of our footsteps swallowed by the surrounding silence, punctuated only by our radio chatter crackling intermittently. As we moved deeper, past the normalized restrictions, an eerie sensation took hold, like something was watching us, waiting. The walls seemed to close in, breathing with a life of their own, the detailed architecture giving way to raw concrete and thick metal plates sealed shut decades ago. We came to the first sealed door marked, "Access denied, authorized personnel only." Jensen frowned, tapping his clipboard. Nothing on the manifests about these rooms. Glad they finally want a look, though. With manager approval, electronic locks were overridden with specialized codes, and the doors slid open with a grinding hiss. The stale smell of mold and rust rolled out, curling in the stale air. Inside, the rooms weren't empty. Old crates and barrels filled the space, stacked haphazardly. But more unsettling were the cryptic markings scratched into the walls and strange, dark stains that dripped like ink from ceiling pipes, freezing in place as if gravity refused to claim them. I shivered, trying to dismiss the ugly shapes as rust stains or chemical leaks. "Probably some old maintenance waste," Sarah whispered, voice barely steady, yet as we progressed, the feeling worsened. Shadows shifted just beyond our light's reach, and distant echoing noises bounced off the walls, low moans or whispers that no one could place. Tom stopped suddenly at another door, his eyes narrowing. "This one's locked tight," he said. "No override possible. We shouldn't be here, this sector's blocked for a reason." Curiosity gnawed at me. I asked what lay behind it. "No one knows exactly," he said grimly. "They just call it the Black Zone. Management keeps it off limits, even from most supervisors. No cameras, no entry logs. Just forbidden." Suddenly, a harsh scraping sound echoed from the far end of the corridor. Everyone froze as we strained to listen, breathing shallow, fingers gripping flashlights. The sound repeated, louder, like something dragging itself close by. Jensen flicked his radio on, but only static answered. Our phones had no signal here, no connection to the surface. "I say we turn around," Sarah whispered. But before consensus could form, the heavy metal door at the end of the hall slammed shut with a deafening bang, sending a wave of panic through us. Trapped in the stale, claustrophobic corridor, light flickering and legs trembling, we realized just how isolated these depths truly were. Then came the worst part, a voice, not human, yet laced with unmistakable intent. A hollow rasp that scraped beneath our skin, barely audible but sharp enough to freeze blood. "Go back." No one moved. The walls seemed to pulse, exhaling a cold so bitter it numbed fingers and toes alike. Our flashlights flickered wildly, shadows dancing like wraiths around us. Suddenly, Tom's face twisted in pain. "Rule 5, he muttered, voice strained. Panic surged. We tried to pry open the slammed door, but the metal refused to budge, cold and immovable as if fused to the concrete itself. Then, from beyond another corridor, shifting shapes appeared, dark silhouettes that had no right to be alive, gliding silently along the walls as if slipping between dimensions. Sarah cried out, stumbling back into me. "No. We need to leave. Now." Fear throttled reason. Heart pounding, I grabbed my radio and tried again for help. Static. No signal. No answer. We were utterly alone. The facility, it seemed, was not simply a building. It was a prison. And beneath its protective layers, something ancient and merciless had been waiting, fed for decades by broken rules and lost souls. Only one rule mattered now. Rule 5. The one we'd all been warned about, the barrier we hadn't dared cross. As the chilling presence drew nearer, the consequences became clear. What happened beyond those doors was not meant to be seen. What lay in the forbidden dark was alive, watching, punishing, and if you broke Rule 5, no one came back. It happened faster than any of us were prepared for. The moment the fragile line between order and chaos snapped was the night that someone I knew, broke Rule 5 in the worst possible way. I can still replay it in my mind, every horrifying detail burned into memory like a scar I'll carry forever. For weeks, the tension in the facility had been building, like a storm gathering force beneath the ground. Whispers of that previous incident during our inspection, the strange sounds, and the unexplained power fluctuations all fed a growing dread that none of us fully understood, yet none dared to question. Everyone lived with an unspoken hope that as long as we stuck to the rules, nothing catastrophic would happen. But that hope died the night Andrews crossed the line. Andrews was a good guy, reliable and quiet, one of those people who kept his head down but helped wherever he could. He had a family waiting for him above ground, and I always thought he'd be too cautious to flirt with danger. Guess I was wrong. The shift started like any other, late and uncomfortable in the deep underground tunnels. Andrews was working alone near one of the older, rarely used sectors, the ones marked, restricted, do not enter, and, of course, falling under Rule 5's sacred boundaries. Why he was assigned there that night, I never found out. Maybe it was a mistake, or a lapse in communication. Maybe he was trying to finish a task before the shift ended. Whatever his reason, he stepped past the warning signs and crossed the invisible line. The first we knew something was wrong was the radio silence. Late into the night, when shifts overlap and check-ins happen, no one picked up when dispatch called Andrews. His usual matter-of-fact responses were suddenly replaced by an eerie silence that stretched too long to ignore. Tom and I were working near Sector C when the alarms blared, sharp, urgent, and unmistakable. The whole facility plunged into red emergency lighting, and lockdown procedures rattled through the speakers, but no one explained what was happening. That we rushed toward the restricted sector, hearts pounding with every echoing footstep. The corridors were unnervingly still, the kind of quiet that felt like a threat. When we reached the door to Andrews's workspace, it was wide open. That was our first mistake, thinking we could just walk in. Inside, the air was thick with something foul, a viscous stench of iron and decay that clawed at my throat. The lights flickered erratically, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. Andrews was nowhere to be seen. On the floor near the entrance was his radio, smashed and silent. His ID badge lay in a pool of dark, congealed liquid that shimmered unnaturally in the light. It looked like blood, but something else, too. Something viscous and alive. Then came the movement. From the deeper shadows, a silhouette emerged. Not fully human, not fully any creature I'd ever seen. Twisted and warped, shifting with unnatural flexibility, it slithered into view with jerky, broken movements. It was Andrews. No, not Andrews. Whatever consumed him had taken form in that sickening, inhuman thing. His face was a grotesque mask of pain and rage, eyes glowing with unnatural light, mouth twisted in a silent scream. We froze. The thing lunged without warning, vanishing as fast as it appeared. The door slammed behind us with a roar, trapping us inside that hellish room. I remember my heart hammering in sheer terror as my mind screamed to run, to scream, to fight, and the paralyzing truth: Rule 5 was not a rule, it was a boundary against something inhuman, something that could warp and devour those who crossed it. The facility's corridors morphed into a nightmare maze. The alarms faded into a distant echo, replaced by haunting silence broken only by distant, guttural sounds and the scrape of claws against metal. Tom and I scrambled to find an exit that wasn't sealed shut by the facility's automated lockdown. We ducked into alcoves, hearts pounding, as shadows danced just beyond our sight, always watching, always hunting. The radios crackled with static, whispers, and sometimes a voice, not human, but speaking in broken, chilling fragments, as if mocking us. I tried to keep my composure, but my hands shook uncontrollably. Everything I thought I knew about this place shattered in that instant, the sense of safety, the detached professionalism, the hope that I could just clock in and out and leave it all behind, that we weren't dealing with machines or equipment failures anymore. We were trapped in a living nightmare, dragged into a shadow cast by something ancient, merciless, and patient. When we finally burst out into the main corridors, blinking under the harsh fluorescent lights, the frantic bustle of other workers returned, but everything had changed. Andrews was gone, vanished without a trace except for the lingering horror that no one dared speak of openly. Some whispered the old stories again, a warning repeated in desperate, terrified voices: break Rule 5, and you don't just disappear, you become part of the darkness itself, erased from who you once were. That night, the facade of control collapsed. Every step after Andrews's disappearance was shadowed by doubt, fear, and the violent certainty that whatever hid beneath us would come for anyone foolish enough to break the sacred rules. I still find myself staring at the signs posted on every sealed door, every warning marker, the words scarred into my mind like a vow: break Rule 5, and it's a death sentence. I survived. But only barely. And I know now, there is no mercy for the ones who cross that line. The seconds after Andrews disappeared felt like drowning in a sea where the waves were made of darkness itself. Panic clawed at my throat as Tom and I stumbled through the maze of bleak concrete corridors, adrenaline pushing us beyond reason. The facility wasn't just a place anymore. It was a trap closing in on us. Heart hammering, breath ragged and uneven, I tried to steady myself. Every shadow felt like liquid black, moving just beyond the edge of sight, swallowing all light and sound. The emergency lights flickered erratically, throwing distorted shapes across the walls, making it hard to tell reality from nightmare. Tom muttered grimly, "We need to find the lockdown control room. Maybe we can override this madness." But every direction we took seemed to twist the corridors into more confusion. I swore the floor plans made no sense anymore. The walls stretched where they shouldn't, the bulkhead doors closed behind us with crushing decisiveness, locking us deeper inside the bowels of the facility. The radio buzzed intermittently, filled with static and garbled voices, some panicked, others eerily calm. Occasionally, a fragmented warning would break through, almost indecipherable: "Do not break the rule." I clenched my fists to fight the creeping sense of despair. How had it all spiraled so fast, from routine work to pure terror? As we rounded a corner, I caught a glimpse of something, a flickering shadow detaching itself from the darkness and vanishing before I could fully see what it was. It felt like the darkness itself was alive, hunting, whispering threats without words. Tom shot me a look, eyes wide with silent fear. Trust was fraying. We both knew the facility concealed horrific secrets, but now those secrets were clawing their way to the surface. That we came across a lone security camera, its lens cracked but still flashing red. I hoped the feeds were being monitored, that someone above ground might be tracking our desperate struggle. But the silence in the speaker suggested no one was coming. As we ran, a crushing claustrophobia settled over me. The ceiling felt like it was pressing down, the air thick and stale. The emergency signage blinked intermittently, one moment pointing us toward an exit, the next twisting into directions that led into dead ends. Paranoia took root as the shadows seemed to mimic our movements, flickering in impossible ways. I glanced behind to find nothing but darkness and a sense of something watching. Suddenly, an abnormal chill swept over the corridor. My breath fogged in the stale air. Then came the sound, a low groan, almost like a tortured rasp, and it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Tom whispered, "We're not alone." We ducked behind a stack of crates, breath held as fleeting shadows crept along the walls. The strange voice came again, incomprehensible but filled with menace. The facility's heartbeat had changed. What was quiet and ordered had given way to chaos and terror. Minutes felt like hours as we scrambled to find a functional override panel. I punched numbers into a battered console, hands trembling, praying for any sign of life beyond this nightmare. Static flooded the speakers before a distant voice cracked through, "Contain the zone, do not let it spread, enforcement protocol active." The message barely reassured me. If there was an enforcement protocol, it seemed too little, too late. Suddenly, the bulkhead doors ahead began to clang and grind violently. A deep rumble shook the ground beneath us as thick mechanical locks sealed shut, trapping us inside this shifting hell. My chest tightened as the realization hit, there was no easy escape. My mind raced as I tried to remember every detail of the facility's layout. There had to be emergency stairwells, ventilation shafts, something to get us out. But the place was turning against us. We doubled back through twisting catwalks and faded signage while every creak and whisper around us felt like the breath of something not quite human. Tom grabbed my arm suddenly. "Listen. We're being hunted. Whatever broke free, it's here now." Fear sharpened every sense. I realized the rumors were true, the facility had become a cage, and we were the prey. I stumbled into a narrow shaft and descended into the shadows below, the metal ladder groaning under my weight like a warning. The air was colder here, tinier breathing spaces with just a faint breeze hinting somewhere beyond. The deeper I went, the more the place seemed to close in, the walls pressing inward, the silence broken only by distant, inhuman cries that made my skin crawl. We didn't speak. Words would only break the fragile thread of sanity holding us together. At last, a faint light, an emergency exit panel flickering weakly. Tom hit the release. A heavy door creaked open onto a steep stairwell climbing up toward the surface. Hope surged. But even in that moment, I felt the darkness underneath, waiting, patient, a warning seared into the very core of the building: respect the rules, especially Rule 5, or be consumed. I don't know how we made it out. Somehow, we crossed the threshold back into daylight, gasping for air that burned sweet and pure, but the memory of the dark inside, the thing that hunted us, stayed, an echo, a shadow clawing at my sanity, a reminder that some lines aren't meant to be crossed, because when you break Rule 5, you don't just risk your job or your life. You risk becoming part of the darkness itself. The days after my escape from the underground facility stretched out in a muted haze, the world above feeling strange and distant, like I'd crossed into some fragile shadow of reality. The sunlight was harsh, and the air, something I'd once taken for granted, felt almost too sharp, too real, as if I was seeing it through a cracked lens. Physically, I was fine, for the most part. No wounds, no obvious injuries. But inside, everything had changed. The memories of what I'd seen down there gnawed at me incessantly. The sight of Andrews, twisted, lost to whatever nameless horror lives beneath the facility, the darkness that seemed alive, waiting patiently, the overwhelming, suffocating sense of dread that I had only just escaped with my life. Even now, there's a part of me that wonders if I really did escape at all. Returning to normal life wasn't possible, not yet, maybe never. I found myself obsessively replaying every detail, obsessively trying to make sense of the shadows, the rules, what that Rule 5 really was. It wasn't just some workplace policy, I realized it was an ancient, fragile boundary meant to keep something contained. As if the facility itself was a prison, and we were the unwitting guards, prisoners, or sometimes sacrifices. At first, no one wanted to believe the stories. Management played it off as an equipment malfunction, a security breach caused by human error. They told us to move on, to forget the rumors and focus on daily operations. But the look in the eyes of people who'd been there longer told a different story. A story veiled in silence and fear. Many had already vanished, some quietly transferred, some never heard from again. I see them in my nightmares, faceless. Orpheus no longer. Orpheus no longer, shadows that move just beyond recognition. I tried to reach out for help, friends, family, even authorities. All met with disbelief or polite dismissal. Just do your job, they said. Don't stir up trouble. But I couldn't stop. I tried to warn others, but every attempt ended with cold shoulders, nervous laughs, or sudden subject changes. The secret of Rule 5 was too dangerous, too chaotic to be acknowledged openly. It was better left unspoken, like an unhealed wound that I learned that fear thrives in silence. The people I trusted most before, that camaraderie we shared underground, fractured after the incident. The facility creates isolation, paranoia, mistrust. Everyone tries to protect themselves, but that means cutting others out, too, and what frightened me most was the feeling that this wasn't an incident but part of a cycle. Rule 5 was there for a reason, to stop the thing beneath us from spilling out, from creeping into the world above. But the fact that people kept breaking it, whether out of curiosity, desperation, or ignorance, meant the darkness would always find a way back in, sometimes, in the quiet moments, when the world feels too bright or too loud, I still hear faint echoes of that underground hum. A rocking vibration deep in my bones, an invisible pulse across the back of my neck. I don't know if the thing waits for me, or for someone else. All I know is that Rule 5 is real. And breaking it will cost you everything. For those still working beneath the surface, I want you to listen closely, obey the rules. Respect the edge where light fades into dark. Never cross that line. Because when you do, you don't come back. They say ignorance is bliss, but not here, not beneath the earth. The deeper truth is that knowing might not save you either. Rule 5 isn't just a rule, it's a warning carved in blood and silence, etched into every cold corridor of that underground prison. And no one, not the company, not the supervisors, not the workers, can change what it truly means. They don't say this aloud, but I can see it in the eyes of those who've been there longer. Every so often, someone slips, crosses that invisible line, and the whole place holds its breath. The darkness waits. It claims another. I don't know what will happen next, or who will be next. But I do know the cycle isn't broken. It's just beginning again. Maybe it's you. Remember this story if you ever find yourself working in some forgotten place below the surface, bones of the earth pressing in, silent shadows watching. If you ever hear a door labeled with a simple number and a warning you choose to ignore, don't. Rule 5 is the last line keeping that unimaginable horror contained. Break it, and you become part of the story, the part no one talks about. So listen carefully, and heed the warning. Some rules exist for a reason. Some lines must never be crossed. Because the price is eternal. And there's no coming back from that.